This is the LatinNews Podcast. I am your host, Richard McColl, here in Bogota, Colombia. We have a very special guest on the line from Italy. We're going to be talking to Samuele Mazzolini. He's a researcher in political science and philosophy at the University of Venice and FLACSO, Ecuador. He's also a Marie Curie Fellow. He specializes in Ecuador, Colombia, Venezuela, and of course the region. And we're going to be discussing Ecuador today. Much going on there, much conflict, war of words and trade wars with Colombia going on, plummeting approval ratings for President Noboa. Crime is going through the roof. I think we need to probably just say welcome on the LatinNews podcast, Samuel. And how did we get here from Ecuador being believed to be the Switzerland of South America and now obviously in a real situation?
Hi, Richard, and thanks for having me at your podcast. Really honored to be here today. Yeah, things have changed quite dramatically in Ecuador over the last decade or so. We went from a left-leaning government. Rafael Correa left office 9 years ago, when the rate of homicides per 100,000 inhabitants, it was like around less than 6%. And now it ramped up to 51 persons per 100,000 persons. Yeah, there's a figure from last year, 2025. Maybe it wasn't like Switzerland, but it was still by and large a relatively peaceful country. It was involved in narco roots, but it was nowhere near to what it is today. It looks like it is the epicenter of drug trafficking in Latin America. Great part of the cocaine produced in Colombia and in Peru, neighboring countries, goes through Ecuador, and it is shipped from there to different markets, the US, to Europe, and as I said, that has been accompanied by a spike in homicide rates. Local gangs have grown significantly. Before these, local gangs already existed, but they were marginal in the crime economy of the country. But now they've been hired, they've been contractors of larger international cartels, Mexican, Colombian, even Albanian, and they have, of course, been strongly financed and armed, and they pose a significant threat to the country's security. And the current government that has launched a crusade against the security reigning in the country hasn't been able to do much about it, right? So it was a very little reduction in the homicide rate in 2024, but it was belied last year again, as I said a minute ago. So it looks like the security policy of Noboa isn't quite working. Alongside the narco routes, you got an increase in extortion. Small businesses are being extorted massively. And yeah, I was speaking about the policies. There have been a number of captures and extraditions of historical jefes, right? So Fito, Negro Willy, Pipo, some of these figures have been taken by security forces, but the organizations behind them haven't been dismantled. They've been atomized. So right now, all these networks, all these organizations, Los Choneros, Los Lobos, Tiguerones, they work more as networks of factions with temporary pacts, which leads to more internal violence and more extortion, as I say. Another thing that isn't quite working is the securitization of the country, which has gone hand in hand with states of exception, with curfews, which have been called every now and then in different provinces, doesn't seem to be doing much. Also because there's no much state building there. For example, the judiciary, that's like a bottleneck, right? So many people are taken to prison, but the judiciary system isn't able to do much about it. Out of 150,000 people that have been captured over the last few months, only 10,000 have been processed so far. So that's a real bottleneck. Plus, the Bukele model that Noboa promised in his last campaign is not simply being delivered, in the sense that he promised this massive new prison, which ended up as a much smaller facility in the end. And all the Barcos prison they also promised last campaign haven't materialized. And I want to, before we close this chapter, unless you want to ask some further question, one thing that should be mentioned is the incredibly high human cost that these policy has entailed. The Inter-American Commission on Human Rights has issued 2 precautionary measures against Ecuador. one for the disappearance of 25 people by the military, and that happened on the heels of another case which involved 4 children in Guayaquil that were held captive by the military and they were tortured. That was really bad, believe me. And then there's another precautionary measure that also talked about, hinted at the really serious health crisis in the prison system of Ecuador. Yeah, the situation is pretty dire over there. And I think Noboa wanted a quick answer to boost his popularity, but it hasn't quite worked.
It's a difficult situation. You have Noboa in power in 2003 in an abbreviated presidency, and then coming back to power after winning in 2023, and 2025. And then you talk about the Bukele model, and of course, arrests and extradition, they play an important role in the removal of criminal actors, but they only disrupt these criminal links and businesses momentarily. And that's what we're seeing is, as you said, the Bukele model of far more authoritarian measures. It seems to me that the government response, as you said, he needed a quick response to the security situation. These rely on purely emergency measures, but below that, are they focusing on anything to make changes on the ground, grassroots changes, so that criminal gangs aren't the most powerful in the regions and in the cities?
I don't see that happening, really. The state has been rolled back since the government of Lenin Moreno. So the president of the state, which had become quite visible in very tangible terms under Correa's government, that has gone away. That has stopped. So all the nice, beautiful social programs that were implemented back then, with all the limitations of Korea's government, of course, but they did provide a future for people, for young people especially. Now that has been taken away. The state has got much less money at disposal because of the austerity measures that have been, as I said, taken by Moreno and then further deepened by his successors such as LaTiNews and then Noboa. And as per the control of the gangs of the territory, what we've seen the last few months is a quite worrying trend, because the violence wasn't, of course, just limited to the coast of Ecuador, but it mainly took place there. And it still does, don't get me wrong. The most homicides in relative terms that take place in the province of Los Rios, but since Guayas is a much larger province, that's where you find the bulk of the assassinations taking place. And yet, you have seen over the last few months an increase of the rate of murders in Quito, which it wasn't a safe haven entirely, but the situation there was significantly better than in different areas. That is starting to be ever less. Also because extortion is rampant, and a lot of businesses, even a lot of businesses in the capital, that can be easily extorted. This is becoming ever more widespread. The state is just rolling back. So in this sense, I don't see the state as being responding correctly beyond these sets of emergency measures that are more like a theater, they're more like a show than a measure that is efficiently delivering. And that explains why Noboa has been losing popularity over the last few months after a period of their honeymoon, which lasted for 2 years and a half maybe.
Significant honeymoon. You mentioned the state a lot, and I think it's probably worthwhile mentioning. So in this circumstances, you think that the institutions in Ecuador are incredibly weak, they're incredibly fragile then, let's say, for processing criminals, and of course for the rule of law, the state has been compromised over the last decade, would you say?
Absolutely, yeah. I think we should speak in large terms about these weak institutions in Ecuador. So it's not just austerity, we're witnessing an authoritarian turn. So the rule of law is really being undermined under Noboa. So what we've been seeing, in concrete terms, is the executive concentrated power and a systematic effort to neutralize every horizontal check that the Constitution provides, combined with a selective use of justice against opposition and disciplining of civil society and media through new laws. Many people talked about Korea also taking a similar route, which was certainly true, but I think this is going far beyond what Korea say 10 years back. So just to be concrete, just to come up with a number of examples, there was a set of bills that were passed last summer, in a matter of weeks, actually. Summer as in European summer, right? So we're speaking about last June to August last year. There was this Ley Orgánica de Solidaridad Nacional, which provided a formal framework for declaring the internal armed conflict. It involved presidential pardon for police and the military, and it opened the door for lethal force with weakened accountability. Then you had this Ley Orgánica de Inteligencia, which provided for broad powers for undercover agents with false identities. You had this Ley de Transparencia Social and Ley de Fundaciones, which regulates NGOs and foundations under an anti-money laundering pretext, but has been denounced by different groups as a tool to amedrentar, to cartel critical groups and their rights to criticize the government. Now, the Constitutional Court suspended a number of articles, these laws, last year, and then sometime later, parts of these laws were declared unconstitutional, right? And that's when this big battle between the executive and the Constitutional Court began in Ecuador, with serious consequences for the institutional stability in the country. So, yeah, let me just add a few more things that I think corroborate what I just said. There has been a suspension of the Citizens Revolution Party, which is the party of Rafael Correa, the main opposition party in Ecuador, for 9 months by the Tribunal de Contencioso Electoral. There was the Electoral Dispute Tribunal, right? Because there were alleged illegal contributions and money laundering involved in the party. In practice, they say that there was money coming in from Venezuela in the 2023 elections. These decisions ratified in April, just a month ago, which means that the next local elections, which have been, that were supposed to take place next year in February, but they have been now, the calendar has been switched, right? They have been set in November. Accordingly, because there's some climate phenomena taking place next year, so they had to be anticipated. But this is a way to leave less time for the opposition to organize. Plus, as I say, the party of the Citizens Revolution is being temporarily suspended. So this means that about 10,000 affiliates of that party now are having to disaffiliate to be able to run. So the movement will participate under alternative tickets. But this is just yet another way to make life for the opposition more difficult. Okay. Another thing that I think deserves mentioning is the case of Aquiles Alvarez, the mayor of Guayaquil. He had very high approval ratings, very outspoken critique of Noboa, and he was a presidential prospect for 2029, right? If I'm not wrong, right? Now he's been taken to prison in a case that has been declared by many as totally political. Let's see what the judges will have to say, but the way the case has been polarized, the way he was held captive, he was taken prisoner at night when he was in his pajama, and the whole thing was filmed. That raises doubts as to how justice is being manipulated by the current government. In actual fact, the UN Special Rapporteur Gina Romero has been publicly denouncing an authoritarian drift taking place in Ecuador. And if we want to frame this, and with this I'm trying to close this chapter, in a sort of academic way, if we want to tap into the academic literature, I think this is a clear case of competitive authoritarianism, as analyzed by Stefan Levinsky. So elections are still there. Somehow opposition can compete, but the playing field is ever more skewed. It makes the possibility for organizing the opposition more difficult. And so this is a drift that is increasing day by day, and it's under everybody's eyes.
This is obviously the consolidation of power by Noboa, of course. This, yes, as you say, an authoritarian drift. Do you think that Noboa was always working towards this after let's say, the failure of his referendums in November 2025? Do you think that this is something I'm going to do this because it's in the best interest of the country to force all of this through?
Just to make a small historical recap, when he was elected president for the first time in 2023, and by that time he only had a year and a half ahead because he was just had to conclude the last mandate of LaTiNews. He was elected on the premise that, yes, he was an anti-Correista, but he was a moderate one, right? So he seemed to adopt a quite conciliatory tone. Of course, there was no room for thinking that he could make life easy for Correistas, but it didn't look that he could go down this route. And certainly his politics and he himself have become more embittered after what you just mentioned, that is the defeat in last year's referendum. That was a big blow for his politics because almost all observers expected his referendum to pass. The year before, he promoted other 11 referenda, right? None of which passed. So you had the perception that the population was actually looking into the single proposals that were being put forward. So now we're past, 2 were rejected back in the year before. Now last year, the end of last year, let me just recall what this entailed because it is important. The first one had to do with lifting the constitutional ban on having foreign military bases in Ecuador, right? So basically what he wanted to do was to bring back some U.S. military base in Ecuador. The second one was about reducing the money being given to political parties by the state. It's a very anti-establishment proposal that almost all observers thought, no matter what, this is going to pass because it is going to tap into a sort of a very widespread feeling of the caste and all that sort of thing. Same for the next one, which was the reduction of national lawmakers by 50%. So in actual fact, the Congress will go from 150 to almost 80 lawmakers. That was also rejected. And the last one was about a new constitutional assembly, right? Of course, the 2 middle proposals that I just mentioned were meant to drag the population to vote yes for everything, okay? And yet, all of them were rejected, which means that, in a way, people were shown to be quite fed up with his politics only months after his re-election, which took place in, if I don't recall correctly, if I don't remember wrongly, it was around March, April last year. One of the reasons people didn't want a new constitution, a new constituent assembly, was that his proposals were quite confused. He never quite said what he wanted. I think the population say, okay, we don't want to give you a blank check. It's as simple as that. And many times during the campaign, he had to backtrack of a number of things he said. So the perception he gave was that of not having his ideas too clear, or rather to be hiding something from the population. But anyhow, that was a hard blow. And yet, he's now trying to smuggle one of the constitutional changes through the constitutional court now. And that has to do with a precise thing. Right now, the designation of the Fiscal General and other positions of control within the state is in the hands of a body which is pretty much under his control, but that body will be renewed later this year in the local elections because that body is elected by the people through direct votes. And he fears that he will lose that body. So he wants those positions, those top state positions, to be designed by the assembly, where he will likely hold the majority for a number of years. So you see, every move he's taking these days is designed to keep his power intact and actually to aggrandize it as much as possible. But these are short-term moves that I'm not sure how long they will work because his popularity is plummeting. So if you look at the last polls, he ranks among the 4 worst presidents in Latin America with around 60% of disapproval. And yet another recent poll suggested that almost 60% are in favor of recalling Noboa. In Ecuador, there's this revocatoria de mandato, which can be triggered either by the assembly, which is never going to do it, or by the people through a collection of signatures. which I don't think will either work, because as institutions have to validate those signatures, and those institutions are in hands of Noboa for now. And we saw that even with Correa, when a bunch of citizens tried to collect signatures to protect the Yasuni initiative that he wanted to revoke, the Correa's control body actually invalidated a number of signatures. So no referendum took place. So I don't think a revocatoria is in the horizon for now. But the prospects for him aren't too good. I know the presidential elections are really far away in time for the time being. But unless he changes course, I think he will have a hard time.
Yeah, as you say, rising fuel costs, crime, unpopularity. So what do? You pick a fight with your neighbor and throw attention another way. Of course, the tariff war with Colombia comes in perfectly. And of course, the 100% tariffs put on Colombian goods and saying that it's a security fee for the lack of security that Colombia has provided to the border of Ecuador. And this is obviously big news here, and of course in Colombia as well, the tit for tat between Gustavo Petro and President Noboa. How is it being seen in Ecuador and from your perspective?
I don't think it is sitting too well with the population, really, and that's why he has started to backtrack already. Look, this tariff war with this trade war with Colombia is a complete nonsense. In the first place, because the motivation he gave it's quite bogus, in my opinion. Colombia and Ecuador have been cooperating on security along the border, the frontier, for a number of years. I don't think there was an insufficient cooperation from Colombia in that regard. I think it was very much politically motivated. And it was also a way to intervene in the upcoming Colombian elections later this month. And that became clear when he said that the tariffs from 100% were being reduced to 50% again after conversations with Paloma, right? With the Uribista candidate, with Paloma Valencia. So that sounds to me as a very blatant interference in the issues of another country, and that somehow imports Trump's style of conducting foreign policy through tariffs and through trade, which it doesn't seem to have worked much, even in Trump's case anyway. But what is really stunning to me is that it is self-inflicted economic damage to Ecuador. Because what you have in Ecuador these days is severe supply problems. Ecuador imports from Colombia a number of goods, not because of an aggressive Colombian trade policy. It is because Ecuador can't produce those goods, and it needs those goods. Medicine, hospital inputs, basic goods, they're all imported from Colombia because of sheer need and shifting to other commercial partners. It takes time, it takes logistics, it takes possibly more money. It has an inflationary effect on the country. And it also impacts on economic players in your country. It's not just Colombian exporters that are being hit. It's also Ecuadorian importers. So I think it has got negative economic effect on both sides of the borders, especially in border zone, of course. Valle del Cauca, the cities of Libya, and are being badly affected these days. But they're just bad. I think that is just silly economic management in my own eyes. And let's see now how the warnings of the Andean Community of Nations will fare. Because a few days ago, the General Secretary published a number of resolutions finding that the tariffs, but also the closing of a number of crossings between the two countries, violate the Cartagena Agreement. And now we all know that the Andean Community of Nations doesn't count much. It is a very fragile, weakened institution, and its invitation to do away with the tariffs. Colombia already said that they will have no problems in removing the tariffs provided Ecuador does the same. Ecuador maybe it's going to take some time before it does. It will probably file a recurso de reconsideración. It will probably ask the General Secretary to review the case again, and then the CAN will have another further 30 days to rule. But I think in a way, the latest shift from 100 to 50 is already signaling the recognition on Ecuador's side that it was a very smart move to do, because it's not doing any good. And of course, the money that has been how do you say, levied through these tariffs, that's very little money. It's $40-50 million. You're not going to go much. You're not going to go anywhere with that money. And of course, the more the tariff increase, the less trade there is between the two countries. So the less money you will get out of these tariffs. I think economically, it just made little sense. It had a political one, but there was really Petro, beyond the ideological differences between the two, which was always on the table. Petro participated to both presidential appointments of Noboa. So in a way, he wanted to make it just with courtesy and show that, okay, no matter what they think, what their ultimate beliefs are, what their policies are, they're neighbors. They need to collaborate. And I think Noboa's move responds much to U.S. pressure, really. As we know, Petro, for a few weeks, has been one of the targets of Trump's rhetoric. Now, he's disappeared from his rhetoric, but, the U.S. don't like having a lefty in power in Colombia, and it looks like that might be ratified in a few weeks. And much better about it.
I want to also. Well, I guess that's something I'll be talking about in a different episode before long. I think there's also one other thing to add is, of course, the energy sales from Colombia to Ecuador, and Ecuador having suffered from severe crippling droughts, and of course relying so much on hydroelectric power. You would hope that Noboa, which doesn't seem like it did, had a backup plan for this, because of course sales have been suspended until further notice. And it seems to me, obviously. Please.
Yeah, sorry, no, I think there was a time delay. What I want to say is that I think now the water levels, and Ecuador relies a lot on hydroelectric energy. The water levels for now are sufficiently high, so there's no immediate risk of shortages, not at least until late in the year. Then go figure what will happen. But yeah, you're right in saying that. It is a risky move. You had that 2 years ago. And in Colombia, it was very crucial, important provider of energy for Ecuador. It does make very little sense also from the energetic point of view.
So it's interference in a neighboring country's elections. Would you say it's total coercion by the Trump government to the ally in Ecuador? Would you say that this is the U.S. interference saying, make life more difficult for Petro and perhaps the continuity candidate of Ivan Cepeda?
Whether it is coercion or it is simple zeal on the part of Noboa, because he wants to compete, of course, now I'm just joking, with Milei as to who is the most favored president in South America for Trump, that it is difficult to tell. But certainly it has got to do with his affinity between Ecuador, this affinity that Noboa has been trying to build with the U.S. We all know he's got very strong ties with the U.S. He was born in the U.S.
He was born there.
He attended Harvard, and he has made no mystery in his sympathies towards the Trump's administration. And he's been invited to this forum of Latin American like-minded presidents in Florida a few months ago. I think, yes.
The shield of the Americas?
Trump is trying. Yeah, exactly. I think that through Rubio, Trump is patrolling the U.S. historical courtyard much more strictly again after some decades of neglect and disattention. Now they care much more about what goes on in Latin America than the previous administrations and what happened in the first 25 years of this century, say.
But obviously tricky times. Samuele, we need to wind this down a bit, but again, I don't see anything. And one thing I want to bring up actually before the referendum in 2025 and the issue of lifting the prohibition of US or foreign bases. There's now, is it an FBI office in Ecuador? Is that right? Am I right or at least the DEA is now definitely working again in Ecuador, right?
Yeah, collaboration has been intensifying over the last years. Already with LATSO, but of course it's grown bigger under Noboa's administration. Yes, a military base is technically still not possible because of the constitutional ban. But this doesn't mean that they cannot cooperate on security matters they work much more in tandem than what they used to do. So yeah, as I say, there's an FBI office and there's a number of trade and other related agreements that have been signing over the last few years. So yeah, I would say the relations between the two are ever more solid. And whether there is a good or bad news, I leave it to the listener, your interpretation.
As you say, elections don't come along until 2029, and that's a ways off. There's so much that could possibly happen between now and then. And of course, the will and the whim of Marco Rubio and of course, President Trump as well, elections in Colombia, the political fragmentation in neighboring Peru. The region looks a little bit on edge at the moment, definitely. So, well, let me take this moment and say thank you so much to Samuele Mazzolini, who is the researcher in political science and philosophy at the University of Venice and FLACSO, Ecuador. He's the Marie Curie Fellow, and he obviously is an expert in all things in this Andean region, Ecuador in particular. Thank you for your time, and thank you for sharing your expertise with us here on the Latin News Podcast.
A pleasure, and thank you, Richard.
You're most welcome, everybody who's listening. Please remember you can subscribe on Spotify, iTunes, YouTube, and wherever else you get your podcasts. We are here every fortnight with a new episode speaking to experts in their fields from the region. I've been Richard McColl here in Bogota, Colombia. Thank you again, and goodbye.